And terrific. I'm gonna okay. All right, everybody. Just a really quick audio check here for our folks on Zoom. Can you all hear us well? Fantastic. Thank you for that. Brilliant. So this is Toronto Product Management Association's April 23 meetup. We are talking about seasonal businesses riding the wave of seasonality. I'm very excited to be joined by Cameron Moore, as well as Blanca, is it Champetier? Champetier. And I'm going to do something unusual. I'm actually going to introduce myself this evening. I realized after some feedback that I never introduced who I am. I'm Adam Aronson. I'm a board member with Toronto Product Management Association for a little over a year now, and helping run events and also acting as the organization treasurer. Our esteemed panelists are going to introduce themselves in a moment. I'm not going to steal their thunder. We'll begin this evening with a land acknowledgement, which is totally obscure here, which is not helpful. Brilliant. So we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We are also acknowledging that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit. And for those of you joining us all over the internet, are on various other lands, and encourage you to become more familiar with the lands that you are on and the traditional people before you. A big shout out and thank you to our community sponsors. We're in the process of reviewing our sponsorships and introducing some new packages and opportunities for the community to come up and speak to everybody and engage with the community. So if you're interested, please see me and I will gladly connect you with our president, Rena, who's running this effort. And with that, I would like to introduce Anna from Brissett, our wonderful space host, to say a few words about Brissett and this beautiful venue that we're in.
Thanks, Adam. Welcome everyone to the Brissett offices. My name is Anna. I'm a product lead here at Brissett. And for those of you that don't know us, we're a digital agency that helps companies build products and bring them to market. So everything from strategy to research, design, implementation, tech readiness, and beyond. And I would say before I leave you, there are speakers that we're very with. We have offices in Canada, Europe, and we are hiring for different roles. So if you're interested in that, and please do contact me after that session. I'll give you more information. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. So we mentioned last month, we have our annual general meeting coming up. We are a nonprofit organization. The annual general meeting is an opportunity for our membership to participate in the governance of the organization. We'll review the financials, vote on new board nominations, take a look back at our year, as well as go through. We're going to be evolving our bylaws. So I mentioned this last time. We made the organization free membership back in September, which has had a wonderful effect. We've tripled in size. Our current bylaws state we need 25% participation in our annual general meeting. I am counting on all of you to vote early and often. You can only vote once, but bring your friends or bring their proxy. So it will be super helpful to do that. And we're also going to do a social for the general meeting. So ideally, we're going to get 250 plus product managers in the community together. Y'all should join us as well. And it ought to be a nice kickoff to summer, just before the, what is it? Is it the solstice, the summer solstice that happens June 21st? Is that the one?
I think so.
It's not an Ethan.
Sounds right.
That's the other one. Brilliant. So then we're going to do something a little bit different for tonight's event. I'm not going to drive a whole lot of the questions. We're really going to rely on you all to help drive the questions. So we've been using Slido to do this. This QR code helps allow you to ask your questions as well as to what am I doing? I'm going to share this. Allows you to ask your questions as well as upload the questions from others. So I'm going to leave this on screen for just a moment, and then we'll take it off the share. For I've also learned that we can make a much better recording and not have a thumbnail for an hour, which is really incredible to watch. So I'm going to stop sharing this in just a moment so that we can really focus on what Cameron and Blanca have to share with us about seasonal businesses. But in unusual form, I have a beer here tonight. So really, I'm going to sit back and y'all are going to drive the questions. So if you don't ask questions, it's going to be a short event. So please get in there and get your voices heard. Brilliant. So then without further ado, I would love for you all to introduce yourselves, tell us a bit about who you are, where you are, and perhaps your most seasonal professional experience. Who would like to start?
I'll start, I guess. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Blanca. Can you hear me okay? I've been told I don't speak loudly, you know? Okay, just let me know if I need to speak more loudly. My name is Blanca. I'm originally from Spain. I moved to Toronto 5 years ago. I started my career in consulting at Deloitte, and I very quickly understood that it's not something that was very fascinating for me. And so I moved to the technology side of things and moved into product management. And so as of right now, I'm leading the product team at Softclass, which is an educational software company, which is definitely my most seasonal business because, as you can imagine, it's really following the trends of like the year of education. Yeah, that's me.
Okay, over to me. I'm Cameron Moore. I've never been told that I don't speak loudly enough. Quite the opposite. So I trust that you can all hear me okay. I've been in product management for, I don't know, around 20 wonderful years now, as you can probably tell by the predominantly white color in the beard. I have sort of been around in different industries and geographies. So started off in Edmonton, moved to the GTA, but then, you know, spent a few years in France, some years in the UK, in London, and then back to Toronto. Loving it here. Most recently, I am the VP of Product and Design at a virtual care company called Dialogue that essentially enables people to talk to a doctor, a nurse, a therapist, etc., on an app rather than waiting around in an emergency waiting room. And my most seasonal business experience, if you don't count working in my father's boat dealership when I was a teenager, which is a very seasonal business. It was probably the 8 years that I spent at Intuit, 6 of which were working on TurboTax, which is sort of the most extreme example of a seasonal business that I could possibly imagine, with, you know, 50% of the business crammed into like the 1 month period before the tax deadline.
Awesome. And so thank you both and welcome. So we've been here talking a lot about SaaS products. We kind of get outside of software a little bit, but rarely. What are the key differences between a seasonal SaaS business and businesses that don't have that sort of lumpiness of seasonality? Taxes might be an obvious one to start with. Thankfully, we don't pay those every day.
Thankfully. Sure, yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. I mean, I think one of the biggest differences is obviously that when you're dealing with a seasonal business, you need to plan your activities to go along with the seasonality. So that includes all kinds of things, you know, from a budget and spending standpoint, maybe from a manpower standpoint. With SaaS, you know, in the old days before the wonderful world of infinitely scalable, you know, Amazon Web Services and the like, you know, you might have to plan to scale up your infrastructure. Some businesses probably still have to do that. But I think one that stands out for me is planning your sort of discovery and delivery activities as a product and engineering team in a way that fits well with your seasonality. So for example, at TurboTax, there's no way we were touching the application during the month of April, ever. It's like a absolute, I mean, unless the world was falling apart, you're not touching that just in case, something would go wrong. So you would spend the rest of the year, you would spend that period measuring, but not actually, touching it, not building anything. And the rest of the year sort of experimenting and building to get ready for that intense period.
Yeah, I would say exactly the same thing. It's a very big challenge that we experience at Blanca. Our seasonality is less extreme than the one at TurboTax or Intuit. But definitely our business is very seasonal because we have most of our revenue and most of our usage through the fall semester. So that's just a few months a year. We also have taken the approach of not touching the application right before the semester starts because that would cause so many issues for instructors and for students. But we are trying very, very hard to, match this challenge of seasonality with our ability to be very, continue being very, doing experimentation in our products through the year without having to, having to wait 3 months or 4 months because it's just like the highest of the years. So it is a challenge, but I would say definitely the biggest thing that changes between a business that is not that seasonal and a business that is seasonal is kind of like how you making sure that you're not taking very high risks when you have kind of like the peak of your usage and your revenue. That is definitely the biggest change of mindset that we have to make.
So I think I want to stay there for a moment. In discovery cadences and pacing, we're trying to learn something. Often we separate out what we learn, make a decision, and then act on it, build on it. And it's like really clear to me in a continuous stream. I can always deliver every 2 weeks. I can deliver software, but in a seasonality where there is this restricted period, maybe once a year, maybe like in higher ed, maybe 2 times, 4 times a year. So how does this influence your discovery practices and the way that you build in these kind of testing and learning cycles? What are the differences, or what are some of the challenges that y'all have run into?
I can take that after speaking. For the discovery cycles, we really try for this to be really continuous, and again, not having that seasonality affect us. But I think the main difference when it comes to delivery is the level of risk that you take at a certain point in time. So, for example, there's no way, as you were saying, that you could release something globally when we don't have very, very high confidence that it's going to work and it's going to cause issues. That is different if you're in a moment of the year where the usage is lower. So I think in terms of the discovery track, this is something there's no right or wrong right away, but I can speak for experience and what I think is actually the best way to approach it in order to continue to move fast and continue to innovate and continue to push for that experimentation is continuing with the discovery track, but really just adjusting your level of risk depending on where you are in the seasonality.
I think one thing that I would add is specifically on discovery, one of the challenges can be how do you find enough volume in your business to do discovery outside of the peak season? And I would say look for the outlier. So in some businesses, this may be impossible, but it might appear that way in tax software. Like obviously everybody must be doing their taxes in between when you get your T4 at the end of February and when the tax deadline is at the end of April. But actually that's not true. I mean, that is obviously the vast majority of when people do it, but there's a steady trickle of people doing tax returns all year. Maybe 2% of tax returns are done in November. And so you can always find the sort of outlier use cases of people who are going to be consuming your product at any point in the year in order to be continuously, just like you said, continuously doing discovery throughout the entire year. So that was very valuable to us at Intuit because we could do things like Intuit sort of infamously had this thing that was called Follow Me Homes, which sounds a little stocky, but actually was just us, contacting users and asking them if they would give us permission to observe them using our product in their home. And we would do everything necessary to make sure that they felt safe in that environment, bring multiple genders of people along and But it was, we would obviously not be doing that, 2 days before the tax deadline when someone is under tremendous pressure to get their tax return in on time. But we were certainly doing that in January, in November, when people are doing tax returns anyway, and you can learn a lot from people using your product in the off-peak times.
Nice. So a question from the audience here. Based on your experience, wanted to ask, is there any difference in the outcomes of experiments held in the on-season versus the off-season?
I mean, probably yes. In my experience, there's just so much more opportunity to learn, like when you have more usage, you have all of the use cases that you would hope for, kind of at hand. It doesn't mean that there's no opportunity in like the off-season moments, but I think there is. You can get to the same levels of learning and the same quality of the learning, but it's just harder to find that opportunity. So maybe you need to put in more efforts in order to get to that same level of learning and quality of the results, or the confidence that you get from the results of the experiments.
I would also say it depends on what kind of discovery we're talking about. And so one thing that I would highly encourage in any seasonal business, even during the peakiest of the peak season, measure everything, right? So make sure that your app or your web application or mobile app is instrumented so that you're measuring every possible event that you can, so that you can analyze it, after the fact. And I mean, that's discovery too, right? It's behavioral discovery. You're measuring what people are actually doing in your application, and then you're making decisions about how to evolve your application after the fact when you have time to sort of consume that information. And that's incredibly valuable discovery. Now, if you want to do, qualitative, sort of ethnographic, like observing someone in their natural environment, using your product in their everyday life, maybe that's better to do outside of the peak period. And yet you do have to account for, how much is this use case a good reflection of how people are using my product during the peak period? But there's no rule that says that it can't be. I think that's just a relevant question that you need to ask yourself.
Yeah. So you're pursuing growth, and you're thinking about the seasons of your business. Is there any difference when you're predicting scale, between a seasonal business and a non-seasonal business? Anything that maybe is a little bit more opaque? We're going to do something, and we don't know how this is going to go and whether or not we're ready for it. Big launch, and you don't have all the evidence to say, we know it's going to have this sort of reaction. Any of those kinds of experiences, for better or worse? I'm not looking for cataclysmic fails, but you got it.
I mean, the first part of my answer is, it's much less of a problem now than it used to be, because very often we're talking about, web SaaS or mobile apps with, essentially infinite scale. So, if your main problem is, I don't know if our infrastructure is going to be able to support 10x the number of simultaneous users as it does in the off season. Well, AWS, etc. I'm not trying to sell AWS, by the way.
Google,
just as happy with
Microsoft,
Google, Microsoft, all of them. But you can use them as essentially, infinite scale. Which is a pretty good idea if you have uncertainty of how many people are going to be using your platform, as opposed to spinning up a bunch of physical servers in your own, facility somewhere. So maybe it's less of a problem than back in the day when we had to print CD-ROMs of software and send them to like Best Buy for people to buy off the shelf and then put in their computer, which was a thing not all that long ago. And I mean, talk about having to predict scale. Like, you really have to be close with your retailers to try to predict, the supply chain implications of doing that. So I think a big part of it is we're pretty fortunate now that a lot of scale can sort of be acquired cheaply and without necessarily needing to know that it's going to happen in advance.
Yeah, I haven't experienced personally many differences between seasonal and non-seasonal business on kind of like how do you manage that, expectations of growth. I think in both cases, you need to have your early indicators in place. You need to understand, what is the traffic looking like and what is going to be the conversion from your users and how many users do you expect to have next week, next month, next year, no matter whether this is flexible or not. There are patterns no matter what. And I think we need to be able to pay very, very close attention to that to understand, how much more usage you're going to be generating in the next while. But I haven't personally experienced difficulty in like understanding where we're going to be and being able to scale the services. As you were saying, this is pretty standard procedure as it is.
So one thing that I will add is just to not give myself the easy out of saying, hey, it's not a problem anymore. Obviously, there are real world challenges. If you're not just talking about scaling sort of infrastructure, what if you're talking about scaling people or teams? And I'll take an example from the current business that I work at, Dialogue, where we have hundreds of doctors and nurses and other kinds of care providers, standing by to consult with individuals. There is some seasonality, some of which is predictable, right? People get sick more often in the fall and the winter than they do in the spring and the summer. Some of it is unpredictable, like COVID. And so it is useful to do some sort of scenario and mitigation planning. Like what if we did have a huge spike in demand? How would we scale up? Where would we go to try to hire more care providers quickly? How successful have we been at doing that in the past? And then set expectations with our clients as well on how quickly we can or can't scale up and down to match, unpredicted demand from the market.
And have either of you kind of run into bottlenecks or choke points, which, I mean, tax day is coming and tax, the CRA or the IRS doesn't really care if Intuit doesn't have enough throughput or enough services. Have you all been caught off sides where you hadn't planned adequately? And I'm not so interested in the fact that there might have been a failure, but kind of curious, like what might have been missed in thinking about the incidents?
I have some examples actually related to podcast. And so when COVID hit and, all learning kind of like became online, we had a huge spike of usage that was completely, I mean, it was kind of predictable the weeks, right before COVID. But before that, we had really no idea that it was going to happen. And so we didn't have outages or anything like that, but obviously we had, an extra amount of usage and that created so many issues for our customer success team, and they were just not able to handle all of the requests that were coming in from customers. So I don't know exactly where we could have done to mitigate that risk, but it's definitely things that happen, and when that happens, you need to be able to react quickly, change your roadmaps, change your priority in order to kind of adapt to the new situation.
So one thing that happens to us, not every year, but it wasn't unusual with TurboTax, is the uncertainty sometimes going into a tax season of whether or not a given regulation was going to change, a tax rule was going to change. Most of the time, we would know well in advance, right? Like a new tax law would be passed or CRA would change the way they interpret something, and we would know that, a year in advance. But once in a while, we would have a situation where we know that there's a change that might come about, but we don't have confirmation yet whether it's going to be applied to this tax year. And sometimes it would be quite late before we would know. And so it wasn't unusual for us to, create new business logic, build a new flow in TurboTax, knowing that we might throw it away and never use it, because the consequence of not being ready was way, way worse than the consequence of the throwaway efforts of building something that we might not use. So, I mean, we try to do that as infrequently as possible. And I'm sure, if you're product managers who work with software engineers, there's almost nothing that software engineers hate more than building something that never gets used. So we tried to minimize that as much as possible. But from a risk mitigation standpoint, with uncertainty of that sort of thing that would come up during the extremely seasonal tax business, yeah, sometimes that was the right thing for us to do, was to build something just in case, knowing full well that we might need to throw it out or we might need to put it on ice until next year.
Was there ever a conversation in the room to like, we're going to wait until the last possible minute to decide to build this thing? Or was it like, no, we have a way of building and we're going to be judicious because it's much better to bake it in now and throw it away later?
I mean, yeah, waiting until the last possible minute. It never really came up at Intuit because generally it was, hey, we know that there's a tax change that's being discussed. We just don't know if it's going to be enacted for this year or not. And so it always, like the risk calculus was easy. It always made more sense to make sure that we had built that. Maybe in some subsequent businesses, like I spent several years leading product at Kijiji. And certainly in that case, there were, just like in almost any business, I think, sometimes there's sort of a waiting game where you're waiting to see if you're going to land that next big client who has a specific new need, a feature that, a capability that you don't have yet. And you're sort of playing this waiting game to see how confident you are that you're going to land that business before you pull the trigger on building that new feature or, solving that next new need. I think that's just a pragmatic reality. Like sometimes you have to deal with the uncertainty. Thus, agile and agility. If the requirements of your universe change, it's beneficial to be agile enough to recognize that and react to it as quickly as possible.
The way this is going, it makes me think a little bit about competition, right? Like if you had perfect information on competition, you could always be ready and you could always preempt and have the better thing. But we have a little bit of information, maybe we've got a little bit of inside baseball, and then you play a little game theory and you're like trying to decide, are they going to do this? Are we going to do that? And it's relatable. I don't know. And so it makes me wonder in seasonality, how does competition and what the competition is going to announce at the big conference or right before the start of school that you might get caught off sides. I don't know, is that something that you all sweat?
Not really on my side. I think there's a deeper question here, a more core question, which is how much do you care about where your competition is going? And don't get me wrong, it is so important to be kind of like in the loop and understand where your competition is. But I think it's also very important to really feel very strongly about your product identity, your product strategy, and your product vision, and the fact that it's like unique to yours. So in my experience, at least, we try to not get too obsessed about competition. And whatever they're releasing the next semester or the next month, whatever, it's not that important. I think what is important is the longer term trajectory and understanding at a very high level where they're trying to go and whether you need to change your strategy to kind of just understand where you want to go, where you want to be positioned in the markets. And that's again more longer term and less about the here and now. What is your competition releasing? Maybe it's a hot take, by the way.
I mean, my experience has been pretty similar to that. I think I've been, like you, fortunate to work in businesses that are usually looking to lead, looking to innovate in whatever market they're operating in, which I think is always more fun for product managers, maybe than the alternative. But it is a legitimate business model to be a fast follower. And so you might be in a business that is very much, where the primary focus is looking at what competition is doing and then trying to follow as quickly as possible. And maybe you're a lower cost provider. In that case, I think, what you were describing probably happens a lot. I can't speak to it with direct personal experience because, like Blanca, I've always been fortunate to be in spaces where it's important to understand what your competition is doing. Competitive intelligence is, I think, a critical part of the sort of product management role. But it's sometimes easy to fall into the trap of letting that dictate your thinking about where you need to go. And instead, I think it should just be one input. To your one of the sort of the fundamental parts of your question around how the sort of game theory of we think that they might be announcing a new feature, should we build it, preemptively or should we wait? I think very often that comes down to looking like if you have one client that's asking for one feature or to solve a particular problem, and maybe there's an RFP and you're in competition with someone else, whether you should solve that problem or build that solution or that feature, very often comes down to a broader question than that one client. Like, is it a capability that you think you're going to need and benefit from with more clients than just that one specific example? And if that's the case, then, you know, very often it will make sense to try to build it preemptively, because if you're going to build it anyway, why not have it first? On the other hand, if it really is a one-off, then I think you need to ask yourself some harder questions. Is this one client important enough for us to sort of divert our attention?
Yeah, and because of the restricted windows in seasonal businesses, like if a competitor drops something right before the start of the season, and you can only sit there and watch it glow while you're at a distance. And so it feels like there's some time pressures that are a little bit different about that competitive set. So I want to take us to our audience. So let's go maybe harder details. Are there unique KPIs that you've used for your seasonal business versus non-seasonal businesses operations? And maybe an important aspect of that is like when you need that signal, and when the amount of time that you have to act on it before the window closes.
Sure. So I don't know if this is exactly related to seasonal business, because it may not apply to Intuit, for example, but in the case of TurboTax, not only TurboTax is a seasonal business, but also, you know, like the time frame in which the user is actually extracting the value of the product is very long. So it's not a transactional business. You know, the instructor signs up, they have to, you know, run the course throughout the semester, and then the student also takes the course throughout the semester. And we really have to wait a very long time, in a few months, to understand whether this will be successful. The instructor found this useful, the student found this useful, and therefore they will, for example, renew. So something that we're paying a lot of attention to is everything, like all of the signals that need to happen, that, you know, represents like the user extracting value from the products, and therefore would result in, you know, a likelihood of renewal. This is something that's maybe in a less seasonal business, or in a business that is more transactional, you can pay less attention to, because you have directly, you know, like the final inputs very fast, and so you can just, like, you know, take that KPI directly. So I think in a way, in this type of seasonal business, what is very important is kind of like, as I was saying before, all of the leading indicators, whatever KPI that is, I think is going to be different depending on the business that you're in. But really that are early indicators that value is there, the customer is getting to that moment, and whatever you need them to do, they will do in the end as a result.
I think I definitely have used some different KPIs in the seasonal businesses that I've been involved with versus the sort of continuous businesses. But we're talking about seasonal businesses a little bit as if they were sort of one thing, but of course there are many different kinds of seasonality. In particular, there are definitely different KPIs for infrequent use cases versus frequent use cases. So if you have an annual seasonal business like TurboTax, then you're probably not tracking, you know, monthly active users or daily active users. It's an irrelevant statistic. It doesn't really make sense for that business model. When I was at Kijiji, we were looking a lot at DAU MAUs, so daily active users divided by monthly active users, as sort of a measure of intensity of usage. You know, how many of the people who use the product once a month are using it many times a month. That was really, really important in that business, and that sort of part of the business was not very seasonal. On the other hand, you know, with TurboTax, you'd be looking more at annual returning users, because obviously it's sort of irrelevant to talk about, you know, how many monthly active users you have, except from a sort of scalability standpoint. But it wasn't so much about how many are coming back month on month. So I do think there can be differences in KPIs. It's not just related to seasonality. It's sort of fundamentally related to what your business model is and whether you're dealing with frequent or infrequent use cases.
I like that a lot, and especially as it ties to this next question. I think a really important thing, and I've struggled with this as I've gone through different businesses and different industries is like figuring out the pacing of the product, what the right KPIs are, the leading indicators, the lagging indicators, and the right way to use this, especially as you're both trying to define them, evolve them, and then, you know, if you're on a semester cadence, it's a long time to make a commitment to this is the KPI and then decide, actually, we want to measure something else. You got to wait for another semester to pass by, right? It can be a lifetime in product management. So the next question that comes here is, how do you maintain user engagement and retention during periods of low activity for seasonal SaaS products? I'll preempt the question a little bit to say, I think it's a little bit of a false premise because you don't always care about the DAOs and the MAUs if it's not your season. So I don't know, how do you all think about this from like a holistic metrics perspective? Are you happy with the metrics that you have, and how did you get to that place?
Okay, I'll take an example from my current business from Dialogue, where we have both infrequent and frequent use cases. So one of the common use cases is people, you know, employees of organizations who have access to our platform will use it on a very infrequent basis when they have a specific health concern. Hey, I think I have an ear infection. I want to talk to a doctor, but I don't want to go and wait in the emergency waiting room. So, you know, I fire up Dialogue and I do a consultation on the app. That's an infrequent use case. On the other hand, we also have a wellness program that's seeking to encourage people to get active, to develop healthy habits, you know, where they're doing enough weekly minutes of physical activity, or, you know, maybe a nightly sort of mindfulness routine to help you sleep better. And so typically what we try to do is when we have members who register very often for an infrequent use case, let's say an ear infection, then we have their information. We can communicate with them through push notification, email channels, whatever, you know, whatever channels we decide are relevant at the time. We have to, you know, balance intrusiveness with relevance, and we'll communicate with them to try to get them to engage with the frequent use cases on the platform. I think that could probably be applied to, you know, a business that, you know, strictly had infrequent use cases as well. Maybe there's some content that you can be doing outreach with to share with people during the off season, just so that you remain top of mind, you remain part of their consciousness, or certainly like leading up to the next peak season, you know, reaching out to the people who used you last time, to make sure that you're reminding them that you're there, so that when they, you know, have to buy a snowboard again for the new season, they come back to you rather than going to the competition.
Yeah, I agree, and I think related to the question, I think it was retention as a KPI and user engagement. I think you have to be very careful of like what you're optimizing for, and it really depends on the purpose of your product and your reason for existing and what you want the optimal experience for users to be. So in one of my previous companies, it was a job marketplace, and we did the mistake of being obsessed with retention. So how many users are coming back after 1 week, after 2 weeks, after 3 weeks? And after a while, we realized this is the wrong thing to optimize for, because in the best case scenario, a user comes in, finds a job, never comes back again. Like this is the best case scenario. So why are we thinking about retention? It's the wrong thing to optimize for. And obviously there is always some kind of like, you're going to gravitate towards that because you want your users to come back to what you created for them. And it's a bit natural, but I think sometimes it can be a trap, and you have to be very intentional about what you're optimizing for, and that will, I think, always be different depending on what solution you're creating and what problem you're solving for the users.
I want to go kind of outside of product a little bit and get into some of the partners that we work with. So thinking about seasonality and the partners, marketing, support, and you know, the messaging, Cameron, that you mentioned isn't necessarily going to come from the product team, and the marketing team is going to have their cadences, and the customer success team is going to have their cadences. So how have you all partnered with the other parts of the organization to have a sort of holistic ownership with the customer base, and remaining in sync and doing it in a very healthy and coordinated way. And is there anything particular about it being a seasonal business that makes it either trickier or such?
I definitely find this incredibly tricky in seasonal businesses. Reason being, I think we're probably all been in that situation where marketing and sales are asking you, like, where are you going to be in 6 months, in 12 months? And, you know, you can't commit to anything. I think when you have a seasonal business that is like happening even more, and it's natural, it's because they want to sell, they're selling the customers for the product that they're going to be using probably in 6 months or in 12 months. So in order to, you know, optimize for impact and for results, they want to sell with everything that will be available in 12 months. So something I can say that, you know, it's a bad recipe, something that you should not be doing is actually commit to a list of features that the sales team can then go and sell, because as you probably all experience is, you know, it always fails. It never happens. You're not able to like meet the commitments. There's always things that you cannot predict on the engineering side. So this is definitely a challenge on seasonal businesses, and I think it's very tough to do. And I will be very honest that I'm still trying to find the right balance. But you have to find the right balance between giving direction in kind of a vague way that, you know, enables and empowers customer-facing teams to kind of like, you know, sell the product with where it will be in a few months from now, at the same time without making commitments, and still kind of like, you know, making progress in the direction that you had set at the beginning. That's my take on this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree strongly with the sense that, or the concept that it can be challenging not to overcommit to like the certainty of a roadmap, especially when you have client facing or customer facing partners, sales and marketing, etc. that you're working with. I think that's like a truism in product management, that will be a challenge forever. I do think that there are some cases where you know that there is a particular problem you're going to be solving. Maybe you don't know what the design is going to look like yet. You haven't built a solution yet, but you know there's a problem you're going to be solving for the next season. I can remember, for example, a time at TurboTax when we knew that we were going to be delivering a new service where you could have like an actual professional tax preparer review your tax return before you submit it to the CRA. So you still do it yourself with the software, but then you can have a review done. And that was new. We hadn't done it before at the time. It can be useful to sit down with your go-to-market partners. You know, for example, the sales team that is doing the, you know, account negotiation with Best Buy for the year to say, like, you know, how many units are you going to take and whatnot. Those clients want to know at some high level, you know, what's going to be new this year? What can we, you know, what can we build our end caps around? What advertisements can go on it? And so I think it can be useful to work with your partners to say, here are the things that we do have a lot of certainty around. Maybe it's not going to be screenshots of that thing yet, but here is sort of how it's going to work. Here's, you know, something you could mock up that stands a pretty good chance of being true, versus the things that have high uncertainty. And maybe, you know, you make the hard decision to not communicate about the things that have high uncertainty because you don't want to paint yourself into a corner. So I think, like many things, it's all about, finding that balance and how much risk tolerance you have for committing to things that may or may not come true on the time frame that you plan.
I'm really disappointed to hear y'all can't make 12-month-long commitments to your sales partners. I think everybody else in the
It's just more likely to be true.
fair. I want a crystal ball as part of my next welcome kit, so that I can, you know, keep everybody happy. So does seasonality have implications for staffing? You know, how do you think about this in terms of getting products ready, service design, delivery, and such?
Sure. Of course, seasonality can have an impact on staffing. For example, in for a little while near the end of my tenure at Intuit, I did an experiment outside of product where I was leading customer service for QuickBooks for a while, for about 6 months. Not the right fit for me. Got back into product quickly, but that is a part of the business where you absolutely need to, even though it was QuickBooks, not TurboTax, but still, I mean, there's seasonality. You need to be able to scale up, I think one of the key things there, when you're talking about scaling up and then down, probably like actual human resources, people, people is a much better word than human resources. One of the things that you need to think about is what is the profile of, like, be thoughtful about the profile of people that you hire because you hope to keep them longer term versus people that you're truly hiring for a seasonal need, right? It's likely that when you come out the tail end of your season, hopefully your business has grown, the off-season size of team you'll need maybe is bigger than it was before the peak season, not as big as it is at the peak. But I think it's really important to actually have a plan for that and to use the staff up period as a great opportunity to identify, the excellent bits, the high performers that you want to keep in the longer term. So that's one tip I would have for staffing up when you know that they're temporary roles. Still be looking for the people that you want to keep permanently.
Yeah, I agree, and I related to product and engineering people specifically. In my experience, we don't take the approach of scaling up depending on the seasonality. Really, what we do is try to, going back to what we were talking about earlier, is prioritize and be strategic and what investment you take when. And so maybe like the same size of the team is not going to be able to take as much during the the peak season because they're just focused on a different kind of work. But we don't scale the size of the team depending on usage because I think that would actually be incredibly hard to manage. And like you want the core team to be there and to prepare for the peak usage, well ahead of time. And that's kind of like what you do continuously through the year, right?
Awesome. Okay, everybody, that's the end of my prepared questions. So we're going to rely on you all. I wasn't joking. There's a theme that's coming through here, which we didn't talk about at all in advance, around pricing. Folks are very keen to talk about revenues, sales, and pricing models. So I'm going to pick out a few of these as a cluster. How do you predict revenue and sales with a seasonal SaaS? Any examples that you might be able to point to?
I can speak from my experience again. I mean, like at Tapa specifically, this is incredibly easy actually, because there's one thing that is good about the small business is that users make the decision in advance. So you will like literally know in the next 6 to 12 months how much revenue in the end, with a high degree of certainty, you're going to be generating because your users actually have told you and they're preparing to actually kind of like use that product in our case with their students. So I think this we can help.
I think the answer to that question differs greatly if you're in a B2B world versus a B2C world. And one of the things that we discovered over years of experience with the annual seasonality of TurboTax was that the usage patterns that we saw sort of very quickly, very early in the tax season were a great predictor of the much higher usage patterns that we would see late in the tax season. So I don't remember what the multiplier was, and it's probably proprietary information anyway, so I wouldn't say if I could, but I do know that, whatever usage we saw, for example, in the first week after the T4 deadline, so after the end of February, I think, was, there was a certain multiplier that we could just count on and be really certain and take to the bank that would be a predictor with a certain multiplier of what our peak was going to be at the end of April. So in that way, we could do some prediction, just based on our previous experience. I don't know that it was particularly relevant though to us in product. Like it didn't have a huge impact on decision making. Maybe it had some impact on things like the like I said before, the supply chain for like printing CD-ROMs and boxes and sending them out to retail, but that's not super relevant in today's world. But yeah, I do think that very often if you've been in a particular business for a few seasons or a few years in a row, the seasonality from previous periods is probably the best predictor you have of the seasonality for future periods. Don't be too locked into that. Allow room for growth and think about what other forces in the market might have an impact. But yeah, your best predictor of future seasonality is probably what happened before.
Yeah. Actually, something that you made me think about that's actually we do care a lot on the product side is it almost kind of like the other way around is how can we predict how many of the users that we have currently are going to come back in the future. And that has like a huge input on like the revenue projections, right? So this is something that in seasonal business, we do pay a lot of attention and it's like an input to the business of, okay, how much is our revenue projection for next year? How the experience actually went in kind of like this peak season is super important to understand because if we know that's fucked up and there's a lot of users that were not happy, this is probably going to end up in lower renewal, and so this actually has to be balanced out in terms of revenue projections for the next.
Another nice thing about the B2B world as opposed to B2C is very often you have you might have clients that are signing multi-year contracts. And so a chunk of your ARR, your annual recurring revenue, is probably very predictable because you might know that 40% of my current customer base is already locked in for next year. And so really all you're trying to predict is that sort of rolling bit of how many new clients and how much are we going to get and how much churn are we going to experience. And that's probably also something where you can make some relatively high confidence predictions based on what's happened in the past.
So to maybe poke at revenue maybe not mattering so much to product-led growth is one of those areas where the product can cooperate and partner with the sales and marketing organization to try to drive the growth of the product, revenue being one of the key metrics of that, and the success of it leading to further investment and to try to enforce that strategy even further. Does it apply in seasonal business? Does product-led growth work there? And does the revenue then really matter?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. When I was saying that I don't think it really mattered, I was talking specifically about this idea that we could reliably predict, how many customers we're going to have, how much revenue we would have at the end of tax season by what was happening at the beginning. But that's a pretty short period of time. If you are in a kind of seasonal business where some product innovation that you have that you delivered, that you've been, working on, that it's, you're counting on it to drive some new business, to, land some new clients that are waiting for a feature that you didn't have, or to, solve a problem that you weren't solving before. Then yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is product-led growth. And in addition to trying to predict revenue based on past seasonality, one of the sort of like modifiers to that calculation, the plus X, should be some assumption based on what have you done that's new, that's going to change that curve this year. Maybe there's a percentage of the total addressable market that was inaccessible to you in the past because they needed a capability that you didn't have. And now it is accessible to you. And so you can assume some percent success in that space for your revenue this year. And I think, I think product managers should always care about the business outcomes of the product that they're building. Because I mean, ultimately, we are building products. I mean, unless you're in a nonprofit, you're building products to solve a need for end users and to generate business outcomes for the company that you work for.
Value and growth every day. Okay, so switching gears again. Can you share an example of any cases where your team implemented a particular strategy or ran an experiment that led to significant improvements in key metrics? Not so seasonal in nature, but
Do you have anything?
So the question is, have your teams ever like worked on something that worked? Like that drove an improvement in KPIs?
I think an example. You want to
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I hope so. Yeah.
all right, but we'll flip to in seasonal SaaS. What challenges have you seen in a pay-per-use model versus subscription model? Are there particular cases where one usually thrives over the other?
Yeah, I mean, that one definitely. And it ties back to what I was saying previously around frequent versus infrequent use cases. I mean, if you have if you find that you have infrequent use cases, like finding a job, which hopefully doesn't need to happen all that often for any one individual, then a subscription model obviously isn't a good fit for that, and a pay-per-use model is going to make a lot more sense. On the other hand, if it's a frequent use case, or if your buyer isn't the same as the user, right? So if you're selling to a business that is then making that available to employees, for example, that might be a case where the individual employees have infrequent use cases, but the business is still interested in subscribing. So there are some real benefits to subscription models. There's certainty in the recurring revenue. It gives you some better ability to predict over time. Investors tend to like recurring revenue as opposed to transactional revenue. There are definitely some benefits there, but I would say just don't pursue a subscription model just because of the sort of financial benefits. Make sure that it actually fits the use cases that you're trying to bring to market.
Yeah, exactly. And if I can bring that example, actually, Kappa is very seasonal, but we do have a subscription model for students if they wish to take it. And it's exactly the case that you just described, right? Like students can actually predict if they are going to need TurboTax just for this semester, or they're going to need it for the next semester of the next year. And so in that case, depending on the use case that they have, depending on where they are in their university path, they can actually choose what makes the most sense for them. So I don't think seasonality really has a big role to play in whether pay-per-use or subscription model makes the most sense. It's really depending on like the use case and like the problem that you're actually solving for the user. That's what it is to that.
Got it. So like deeply understanding your customer and figuring out like, how do I exchange value with them and do it in a way that's going to be constructive and balanced for both sides.
Yeah, and you might have, like I painted maybe a falsely sort of binary picture, like it's either a fit or it isn't. You might be able to segment your market by sort of intensity of usage and offer subscription to some and transactional to others. So there are lots of great examples out there right now of that. Amazon Prime, Uber, is it Uber One or whatever where the intense users are interested in subscribing because they're using your product so frequently, they're getting so much value out of it that paying a monthly subscription fee in return for getting some kind of like a discount on the individual transactions makes a lot of sense for them as an individual, makes sense for you as a business because you're sort of locking in you're preventing churn, you're getting some certainty in the revenue over time. But then you're not losing the customers who aren't using your product frequently enough to want that. And maybe there's like a middle ground where some aspirational customers you're sort of promoting up to using more frequently because they subscribe.
Yeah, I could see some patterns between seasonality and kind of like that use case that you were describing. So for example, I use TurboTax to file my taxes. I probably wouldn't be a fan to pay a subscription every year to file my taxes because just mentally you're using it like once a year, right? So this definitely plays a role, and there's probably some patterns, but yeah, there's probably like no vital out there.
So we are going to wrap up with this one. How did you end up in product, and what keeps you excited and nervous about the product world today?
What keeps me excited and nervous is AI, man. that shit is moving very fast, very, very fast. And I think we all have to kind of like catch up to it. So that's definitely what keeps me super excited and scared because there's like so much opportunity, so much possibility, but it's so new. And I think the real one of what's possible is just, I know it doesn't fit my head yet. So it's definitely exciting and scary as well. How did I end up into products? So as I said before, I started my career at Deloitte and very corporate, definitely not my thing. And so I started advising entrepreneurs on how to launch their first version of their mobile app. Very fast, very lean, kind of like, very much experimentation mindsets. And so one of my clients was actually a startup that hired me as a product person. I didn't even know the product's role existed back then. That was more than 10 years ago. So yeah, that's how I ended up here.
So similarly, how did I get into product? By accident, and didn't even realize that I was in product when I was. Yeah, I was in France and I had to find a company that would sponsor me for a work visa so that I didn't get kicked out of the country. And I took the first job that I could get. And it turned out, I mean, I didn't start in product. I mean, nobody goes to school for product. I don't, as far as I'm aware, that's still not a degree program anywhere. But, I was in marketing and then joined this company where I was like, going into the field and meeting our clients and seeing how they used our products and then bringing that information back to our factory that built actual things that are like plastic and metal and figuring out how to build better things that met our clients' needs better, which sounds a lot like product management, which I didn't know at the time. And then when I moved back to Canada, I got hired into an actual software product management job, which I still to this day at Intuit. I don't know why they hired me. I'm really, really glad that they did. But I probably wouldn't have hired me at the time. And maybe I have to learn something from that. But yeah, like many people, I kind of got into it. I fell into it a little bit by accident. But I've enjoyed it every step of the way since then. And what gets me the most excited, maybe AI as well. I think I'm a little bit less nervous, probably just because I've been through so many like industry revolutionary changes, like going from installed software to SaaS. Maybe today, looking back, that seems like no big deal, but at the time it was mind-blowing. Like, come on, I'm going to do my tax return online. Are you crazy? Nobody puts their tax information online. That sounds like a scam. And then going from web SaaS to mobile, like, wait a second, people are going to like do stuff with the phone in their pocket, like not sitting in front of a computer with a keyboard. These were like major ground shifting changes in the industry, just like AI is today. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe it'll be more fundamentally different, but I'm excited. I'm more excited about it than nervous.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's going to be the Terminator Skynet by Friday, but there's definitely a pretty rapid pace of change.
Yeah.
Can we get a huge round of applause for him? So a couple quick notes. Our conversation next month will be around financial rigor in product management. And then again, our annual general meeting, which will be a social, is coming up. Last month, we said our blog was coming. This month, we are saying our blog is live. So if you haven't seen it, go to tpma.ca. And we are still inviting guest authors. So if you have interest in writing or you've been thinking about some, please drop us a line, info@tpma.ca. So this was a fantastic conversation on seasonality. Could we get please one more round of applause for our speakers? Thank you, everybody that joined us online. We are going to end the broadcast at this point and do a little networking. If you're jealous, we're sorry that you weren't able to join us, but you should join us in person next time. So we will see you all there.